Good morning, everyone. My name's Mireille Juchau. I am not the host that you were expecting. I'm actually a panellist, but I'm stepping in as the interlocutor as our second interlocutor has COVID. So I'm going to try and juggle being a panellist and a interviewer, but mostly an interviewer, I think, because we've got so much to talk about with these two fabulous books. But before I get started, I'd just like to introduce Eleanor from the Jewish Climate Network. She wants to just have a quick word, and then we'll get going.
Thank you and good morning. I'm just going to go behind you temporarily. Thank you, everyone. My name is Eleanor Hasenfratz. I work for the Jewish Climate Network here in Melbourne. And it's a real privilege to be standing here on Bunurong land and at this event, which to me feels like an important part of the heartbeat of Melbourne's Jewish community, to be speaking about climate change. Two of my favourite things combined, the Jewish community, climate change, together at last. I just wanted to give a quick introduction to orient JCN in the picture of hearing from these three remarkable panellists and the importance of speaking and conversation and storytelling within our own Jewish story. We have a very rich tradition of storytelling and book giving, and we believe in the power of books and stories at JCN, and it's very much not uncommon to hear of people within the climate movement saying, read these two books to a friend or a colleague and then come and work with me. And it works. So I highly recommend buying multiple copies of all of these books, giving them to people who are passionate, not yet quite on the journey, not yet quite unlocking their potential, and saying, read these and then join us. Because, yeah, the system works. For those of you who are avid readers of the Australian Jewish News, which I'm sure many of you are this weekend, you might have seen a half-page ad from the Jewish Climate Network saying, you can't solve a problem that you don't talk about. Luckily, Jews love to talk. And so that's a firm part of what we do. We have conversations, and you can speak to me afterwards about having a conversation with your friends and colleagues to further what we're hearing from today. And it's really important that exactly what is happening today, sitting down and really deeply listening to the stories of climate change, the stories of our future, our hopes and our dreams, where we sit and fit within all of that as Jewish people as well. That has to continue in so many different formats. Talk to your dentist about it. Talk about it at Shabbos dinner. Apologies for my wriggling 3-year-old who insisted on coming to the town hall because he saw Play School here last week and I think he's very confused. So these conversations must absolutely continue and we can support you to do that. But we also know that conversation, given the hugeness of the challenge in front of us, conversation must immediately lead to action. And JCN is here for that. It's here for our community to turn these words and thoughts and our changed feelings into strong action. So on Monday night, we are launching a massive project called the Zero Emissions Jewish Community, where we are helping the Jewish community, particularly in Melbourne, to decarbonise, whether it's a home, a business, a school, a shul, an organisation, and all of us have a part to play, whether it's the school you went to 20 years ago, call up the principal and say, this matters to me, how can I help? Whether it's your own home, whether it's your business. So please come and talk to me about that afterwards. And thank you so much for your time. And I'm very excited to hear and deeply listen to these very skilled speakers. Thank you so much.
I'd firstly like to acknowledge that we're sitting on the country of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge Australia's first storytellers and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and respect the traditional owners, their elders, ancestors, cultures and heritage. And just to remind you to put your phones to silent, please. I'm going to get Danielle Celermajer and Danielle Sherrell to introduce themselves because it saves me a bit of homework, late night homework. And I'll just briefly say I'm the author of The World Without Us, which came out a few years ago, and I'm an essayist and critic as well. But Danielle, would you like to start and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Mireille. And thanks everyone for being here. It's so good to be in conversation with people. My name is Dani Celermajer. I actually will start not with my profession, but by saying that I have chosen in the last few years to live on an intentional multi-species community. And that's a very important part of my work at this time, not to just write and think as a human being over and above the planet, but to be embedded in the planet. So even though my name is on this book, Summertime, it was written from the heart of that multi-species community. Apart from that, I'm a political philosopher and the Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney.
Thank you, Danny. Always good to speak with another Dan. Yeah. My name is Danielle. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm here from the States. And I think I inhabit a very different part of the broader climate movement space than Danielle. And I'm incredibly curious to hear more about the multi-species community because it speaks to something, a voice in the depths of my soul that cries out when I'm in the hallways of power in Washington, being like, I have to engage with this system, but also there's so much wrong here. And there's so much that doesn't sit well in my soul. I'm an organizer, a climate organizer. I run campaigns in the States, fighting, frankly, uphill battles to make our government on the state and the federal level protect its constituents from the climate crisis, and trying to wrest the helm of our democracy from the fossil fuel industry, which is quite a task. But I've also written a book called Warmth, which came out last year, and I occasionally contribute to other places like The Guardian and The Washington Post. Thank you, Mireille. It's orange. It's easily identifiable. They're all orange. Wow.
Yeah, I think that says something about the topic we're writing about.
I think we can end the panel right there, frankly.
And my middle name is Danielle, so it feels like fate. Yeah. Thank you both. So it's really tempting with a topic like climate change and writing to focus on the issues and to talk about the politics, because it's obviously front and centre of so many of our minds, particularly given the last 2 weeks and the election. But I really want to get into the craft of how these two writers have tackled the subject. So I might start with Danny and ask you to tell us a little bit about Jimmy and Katie, the land you live on, and what happened during Black Summer, because that sort of formed the basis of, I guess, the beginning of this work, Summertime.
Thanks, Mireille. So the Black Summer fires is actually something of a misnomer, because the fires started to burn at the end of August, so at the end of winter. And the fires were burning in the north of the state. We live in New South Wales, through September, October, November. And then in November, they came to the area where we live. And as I said, we live on an intentional multi-species community, which means we live with lots of other animals, the rainforest, the river, the soils. And we had thought that we would be able to keep them safe by creating safe paddocks, moving wood, clearing areas, opening gates, and so on. And then on the night of the 28th of January, it became evident to me that the fire was close and the fire was deadly, and that even if the animals were in safe pastures, whatever safe means in this era, the removal of the oxygen from fires that were this gargantuan would kill them. This was happening all over New South Wales and the coast of Victoria. Animals were dying because the oxygen was being taken out from the fire. And so we decided to evacuate everybody who could be evacuated. The wombats, the echidnas can't be evacuated. And there was an extraordinary network that had emerged in our area, Horse Rescue Shoalhaven, where animals like goats and horses and donkeys and sheep could be evacuated to other properties. But Jimmy and Katie were two pigs who lived with us, and no one really wanted to rescue pigs. Pigs are an unknown quantity. And so I contacted the woman who had originally rescued them from the floor of a factory farm. They were called wastage pigs. They'd been thrown aside just to die when they were rescued by activists, and then by M, as I call her in the book. And she picked up the phone when I called, and she said, "I was expecting your call. I'll be there tomorrow." And she came to collect Jimmy and Katie on Sunday, the 29th of December. And on the morning of the 31st of December, my partner, L, as I call him in the book, we had packed up our house, and we'd packed a truck the night before, and he had driven to Sydney at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I went outside to roll the gas bottle away from the house because we were evacuating. We were expecting the fire to come that day. And when I came back in, I saw that my mobile phone, which was normally joined to me like part of my body because I was constantly looking at the Fires Near Me app, that there was a missed call from M. And I called her back, and M lived in Cobargo, so everybody knows what that means. Cobargo was the epicenter of the fires. And I called her back, and she just said, "It's all gone." And Katie, they're dead. And she had barely survived. I won't go into her story now. And then 24 hours later, I got a text from her saying, "I found Jimmy," which I assumed meant that she had found his body. But a few moments later, a very granular video of Jimmy running towards the camera with a blackened face, and M's voice saying, "I know, I know." And so a week later, we were able to go down and collect him. All the roads were closed until then. And we collected him and brought him home. And when we first brought him home, he went into his mud bath and covered himself, and he ate watermelon, and he went to sleep, and he seemed okay. But the next morning when he got up, he started to just look around, and it felt like he was looking for Katie, and it felt like now he was home, he could stop being hypervigilant, and the trauma started to enter his reality. And so I wrote about him and his grief because it was so important for me to convey that humans aren't the only ones who are having the experience of climate catastrophe. Other beings are also not only objects of climate catastrophe, but they're subjects. They're feeling it, they're making sense of it, their relationships are being disordered by it. And so that was really the beginning of writing Summertime, was writing about Jimmy.
And some of you might have read a couple of articles that Danielle published at the time, which we'll circle back to in a later moment. But I might switch to you, Danielle. Your book starts with a fire as well, a very different kind, and it's written as a form of address. Would you like to talk about your choice to write the book in that way and why you chose that particular perspective to write from?
Sure. So I really did not set out with the intention to write a book that I would publish for an audience. I first put pen to paper on Warmth, or it wasn't pen to paper, it was just little notes I would tap out on my phone on the subway as I was heading to work at my climate organizing job, where I knew I was, every day facing down 8 to 15 hours of conference calls and emails, or sometimes I was, locking myself down outside a senator's office. Sometimes I was in that senator's office meeting with them. Really exhausting work in the trenches of sort of the political war that's happening in a lot of our democracies right now. Between the people that want to stand up for the thriving of all beings and those people who see beings as a resource from which to extract value. And the heaviness of that work sat with me in the back of my head at all times, but it was sort of undigested. And it was a thing that, in order to engage in the political process, I sort of had to put in this Pandora's box that I didn't look too carefully inside of. And, you know, I was 8 years into my career organizing in the youth climate movement, where I intuited that this undigested mass of emotion that I had kept at bay in order to engage in the democratic process, it was just going to kill me if I didn't look at it in the face, if I didn't engender a real emotional encounter. So I started writing these little notes to myself, sort of like a diary. And I think it might have initially been at the suggestion of my therapist, with whom I spoke almost exclusively about the climate crisis. He asked me about my mom, and I was like, my mom's great. My mom's really not the problem.
But your dad's a climate scientist, right?
He's an oceanographer.
He's an oceanographer.
So yeah, I heard about global warming at which was a term of art in the 90s when I was about 6 or 8. And it seemed like an enormously big deal to me, but I didn't see the gravity of that import reflected in any of the places that I would have looked for it, on television, in my teachers, on any of the politicians talking on the TV, so I sort of buried it. And this writing process was sort of an excavation in a way. And the more I wrote, the more I found myself addressing somebody. Like, I needed an interlocutor to have this, what felt like an extremely vulnerable conversation about how I could, as a young person, make meaning when the image I'd had of my future growing up as a small child was replaced entirely with one that looked increasingly grim. And the more I spoke to this person, the more it seemed like, okay, I've sort of invented this interlocutor who I can both be very tender with and who seems very close to me. And it felt like a process of discovery of like, oh, this person I'm addressing is my own hypothetical future child, who I felt deeply ambivalent about the prospect of bringing that person into the world. And so the book kind of became a discourse and an apology and a commiseration with that person. And I think it was a conduit for me to vulnerably access my own emotions about the climate crisis, which I think is, I don't know, like many things with the climate crisis, we're so behind the 8 ball in figuring out how to talk about this as a culture, and how to access the grief, an ecological grief, which we haven't been taught to feel, without drowning in it. And writing this as a letter, feeling like I had some other person on board with me on this project, even if it was a projection of my own imagination, made it feel a bit safer, or I could go a bit deeper.
So Danny, once you knew the fate of your 2 pigs, you went on to write the book in quite a short space of time. But one of your articles that you published, I think before the book came out, was an article that went viral, and it was about the Black Summer fires, in which you used the word omnicide to describe that experience of seeing the killing of everything, which is what I believe omnicide means. Can you talk a bit about that term and how that might have kind of shaped the way that you write the book? And one of the features of Danny's book is a real engagement with some of her legal, philosophical background, but also, Jewish texts and a whole range of other resources that she uses to kind of tease out this question around what we're doing when we're killing everything through neglect of our environment. And yeah, can you talk a bit about that?
So I think it's very important that we understand that ideas don't come out of nowhere. I mean, you spoke about the emergence of your ideas, and all of our ideas come out of our material encounters with the world. And on the second terrible catastrophic fire day, the 4th of January, we had again evacuated and we were driving back from Sydney, not knowing whether the land had been burnt. And we were listening to the radio, and I noticed that there were two terms that repeated themselves in the description of the Black Summer fires, that this was a natural disaster and that this was a tragedy. And the moral error of those terms really struck me. There's nothing natural about fossil-fueled catastrophic fires. This is a nature which has been infused with the violence of capitalist modernity. So that term is highly problematic. But tragedy is something that Sophocles or Shakespeare wrote about. Shakespeare wrote in King Lear, as flies to boys are we to the gods. So both of those terms really erase responsibility, human responsibility. And it was on that drive that this term, omnicide, came to me, the killing of everything. And the term became important to me for two reasons. Firstly, because climate catastrophe, the impacts of climate catastrophe are, of course, highly unevenly distributed, but no one is immune. And so all of these different sides that we have, homicide, matricide, genocide, they're specific, but this is a ubiquitous killing. And so that's what the Omni captured. But the side was probably the most important part of it, that this is killing. This isn't accidental or unfortunate death. This is killing, and where there is killing, there is responsibility. And so it was the infusion of responsibility into the way that we describe what is happening that was so important to me. And of course, I'm the child of survivors of the Shoah, and we know Raphael Lemkin, whose family was also murdered. After the end of the Shoah, he realised there was no term for what had happened, and so he came up with the term genocide. And that term then became the basis of the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide. But if you don't have language to describe something, you can't go to work on it. And so finding language, and I'm not claiming that this is a language that captures all dimensions of what's happening, but it was a way into beginning to be able to hold the scale, the intensity, and the gravity, and the moral implications of what was going on.
Yeah, I did. It's such a useful word and such a, it cuts me to the quick, honestly. And I think about that instinct to omnicide. Like, where does that come from? It does still feel so strange that this is the society we've built and that every bushfire represents a choice, as you've pointed out. And where do those choices come from? Like, how did we turn into a civilization that sort of, we've turned against our mother, or we're just wrecking this incredible bounty we've been gifted. Mm-hmm. It seems, it inspires rage and inspires grief, but it really does. It's difficult to imagine myself into the shoes of a fossil fuel executive or any of the many numbers of people. And we're all implicated in the choices we make to form our collective society, but the level of responsibility is vastly disproportionate. And it does sometimes feel to me like that instinct to omnicide is a response, almost a fear response to the unbelievable complexity, beauty, and multiplicity of the world. It's like our minds are just too limited to take all of that in. And so capitalism's response is to, as much as it possibly can, turn everything into a number and make it all fungible. And then it can fit neatly inside our extremely limited cognition. And we don't really have to, be saddled with the yoke of the ineffable at all. We understand it because we've turned it all into numbers. And I think burning something to the ground is a very good way to turn it into a number, or at least reduce its inherent complexity, which is what omnicide is about. So when I think about like what's the instinct that can stand in the way of that instinct, of a sort of death drive towards simplicity, and towards hubris, that we could contain the world within ourselves. Of course not. It's a sort of humility, but it's also a sort of joy. Like, my God, this is uncontainable. This is totally uncontainable. And it contains us, not vice versa. And that feels like a practice of humility that I'm still, having grown up in the 90s in central New Jersey, trying to like step into, because it wasn't how I was taught. But that's like one of the threads of hope. One of the many threads of hope I sort of grip onto is that, like, in fact, the project of fighting back against that death drive is an inherently beautiful project. And I'm lucky to be engaged in it.
Can we talk a bit about language? And last night when we were talking at the gala, Daniel, or before the gala, we were talking about Zadie Smith's essay, Elegy for a Country's Seasons, I think it's called, and I noticed that you reference it in your book. But I've just got a beautiful quote from that essay which connects to both of your work and to mine, actually, because I was really interested in kind of documenting the effects of climate on the inner life of a family, so that kind of evoking solastalgia, which we can talk about a little bit later, perhaps. But the quote from Zadie's essay is, "There is the scientific and ideological language for what is happening to the weather, but there are hardly any intimate words. Is that surprising? People in mourning tend to use euphemism, likewise the guilty and ashamed. The most melancholy of all, the new normal." I thought that might be a good point to sort of start talking about the nitty-gritty of trying to capture this in writing. And in your case, Daniel, you chose not to kind of include the many, many statistics and kind of heavy research materials that you're dealing with in your work life, and you chose a different approach for the book. And Danny, you have a background in law. You're an academic in law. You're a professor at Sydney University. So you've moved from a discipline that demands a certain kind of academic writing that's backed up by fact. How do you both kind of put that aside, and what sort of decisions did you make when you put the work together to address this question of how we account for what this is doing to our inner lives, which is, after all, what writers do best, you know? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I can try to jump in. I mean, yeah, I think I made a very intentional choice from the very beginning of writing my book that I was never going to use the words climate or climate change, because to me, the phrase felt dead in a way. It felt flat, it felt played out, and it felt like it was being purveyed to us by a technocracy that saw the climate crisis as mostly a problem of CO2 in the atmosphere, when I think it's a much more fundamental epistemological and ontological problem about how we relate to the world around us and how our minds are being shaped. And I felt like, even for myself, and certainly for a lot of the people in my everyday life, when you hear the words climate change, you kind of shut down, or it's like immediately shunted into this very narrow environmental pigeonhole. And I wanted to break it out of that box and engender, the old writerly trick of make it new again. Like, you have to make it new in order to engender a real encounter. And that was very difficult. I mean, there were all sorts of ways in which I felt the limits of language in writing this book, the limits of my power as a writer, and the limits of the thought we've engaged in collectively to try to make sense of what's going on around us. Because in a way, I think we're experiencing a huge degree of cultural whiplash. I mean, I think about part of this book is like tracking the emergence of the climate crisis from 1990 when I was born. It was a sort of niche research topic that my dad knew about, but not many people were talking about. the emergence of that into this ongoing crisis that is going to shape everything about the way we live on this planet for the next several centuries at least. And the strangeness of that transition tracking exactly my coming of age, so that I was born, in the matter of 2 decades, my very basic assumptions about what the future held and how the world worked and how we related to the environment were completely flipped on their head. And I think that was true at a societal level, and that the culture is catching up and the language is catching up, and we have a lot of work to do.
Danny?
Maybe I can start that question by reading a short excerpt rather than talking and then reading.
That'd be great to hear.
I'll just read a short
from both of you.
excerpt.
Yeah.
An unfathomable number of wild animals have been killed. Based on what we know about how many animals live in a given area of bushland and the area the fire destroyed, the current estimate is 3 billion. I'm sure that number has been useful in provoking a certain intensity of shock, but I'm cautious of numbers so large we cannot imagine them. Besides, numbers are flattening, as if there exists 3 billion units of some item that designates wild animals. A closer way of knowing all this death would be to bring the attention of one's mind to this being who had this form of life and these relationships, and then they were killed. Then move your mind to this being who had their form of life and their relationships, and then was killed. And then move your mind again 3 billion times. I've done a quick calculation. If you spent just 10 seconds on each of those animals, barely enough to register them as individual beings, the process would take about 950 years. 11 good human lifetimes doing nothing but contemplating the death of animals by these fires in this country this summertime. So I actually did that. I was sitting at my desk. It's now estimated to be 3.25 billion, which is 1,030 years. I did the calculation the other day. I was sitting at my desk and I was trying to work out, how can I make sense of this, let alone convey it? How can the knowing of an abstract truth become a knowing of the body? Because when you know something in your body, to go back to what you were both talking about earlier, you can't but act. When you know that those who you love are under direct threat, and your future, as Josh said, your future, the future of your children is under threat, it's not a choice, am I going to act on it? It's like putting one foot in front of the other. And it's that type of knowing that we need to move into. I remember when my daughter was a teenager and she became very ill, and I had the experience that there was nothing to do but to do everything in my power to make her life possible. There was no debate to be had. There was no arguments. I wasn't going to waste any time arguing with people. And it's that quality of affective, embodied knowing. And I think, to speak to something that Josh was saying, I think we need to be very curious about this question: how did we get here? Part of how we got here is that business as usual is that all other beings are resource to be extracted. That's just the air that we breathe. It's not something that we wake up and we go, oh, I'm going to use the earth as a resource. That's just how the world naturally occurs to us. And so unless we get very embodied about our knowledge, very affective about our knowledge, we're not going to have this transformation where the world occurs for us, as Hannah Arendt said so beautifully, as a world that we love enough to take care of it.
And I think, just to follow up on that point, which I think is such an important one. I mean, the difficulty of the task is, on the one hand, as a society, I think we're in the process of trying to reacquaint ourselves with a thing that we've lost touch with on a deep level, and turn our attention again and our love again, and have society, the borders of society, bleed out beyond the human. And that is actually fundamental to our own survival. We thought we could, we could sort of excise ourselves from the rest of that community, but in fact we cannot. They're our lungs, they're our hearts, they're the rest of our body. But the irony and the difficulty is that as we train our attention back on that world that we've neglected, what we have to come to terms with is a lot of death, you know? And so it's understandable that a lot of people don't want to look at that. But the way I try to think about it, again, to follow up on your example, is like, when you have a loved one and they're sick, and I've experienced this as well. I think of my grandmother, who was essentially bedridden for a year before she passed. When you're sitting next to that bed and when you see that person sick, that intensifies love, that intensifies your love in an almost unbelievable way. At least that was my experience. And so that's sort of one way that I try to relate to this question is, in some ways, the peril that we've put all the rest of the natural world into. I don't want to say the natural world, we've put our community into. That sort of provides a backlight and reemphasizes for me how fucking precious it is, how beautiful it is, how much I love it. And in a way, that's a gift. It's an ironic gift. It's a sort of like, you don't know what you got till it's gone kind of gift. But I'm gonna step into that headspace anyway, because I think it does a lot to teach me. And again, this is my ongoing practice of finding, tracing silver linings around a pretty dark cloud.
One thing that strikes me about that question of responsibility and our involvement is that the work that I'm doing at the moment around epigenetics has really brought home to me the fact that we are absolutely intertwined with our environments, to the point that now we have material research coming out that shows that babies are born pre-polluted. They are born with microplastics in their systems. There's lots of research now about the aftermath of the fires, where women who were pregnant during the Black Summer fires and breathed in the smoke often went into labour earlier, and their placentas, when they removed their placentas after they gave birth, some of their placentas looked like they belonged to a heavy smoker. So that happened to a friend of mine. Her partner gave birth early and her baby was smaller than normal, and her placenta looked polluted. 5 minutes to go. So we live on the false belief that we're separate from our environments, but we're absolutely intertwined with them, and that our ability to control our futures, our children's futures, is out of our hands completely, not just in terms of the environment, but we cannot even protect them within our own bodies. We are an environment ourselves. So I found that really interesting to look into. We have 5 minutes to go, so perhaps we can hear a little bit from your book, Danielle, just to get a flavour of the writing, and then if there's time, we could take a question or two.
You know what? I'm happy to share with my book for anybody who's interested afterwards, but I actually just wanted to add one last thing.
Sure.
One last point, because I feel like it's easy for conversations like this to just feel like an elegy, to feel like we're at a funeral together, and that can feel really hard. But the book I tried to write, and the book I think I have written, is a deeply anti-fatalistic book. I think that Danielle and I were talking about this before the session, that hope is not a feeling that you have, it's a practice that you engage in daily. And in this great societal battle between the forces who would devour the world and the forces who would regenerate it, like, we're going to win. Failure is built into their system. That's what an unsustainable system means. And so I guess I just wanted to end this conversation, or at least my portion of this conversation, by trying to unify, and this is what I've tried to do in the book, the grieving space, but also the space in which we recognize our own power, which is enormous, truly enormous, and that we are part of the constituency that is going to decide whether we transition to a 100% renewable energy economy by the year 2030, by the year 2050, or by the year 2100. And in that balance hang literally billions and billions of human and non-human lives. And that's an incredible responsibility, but I truly can't think of a more meaningful way to live a human life than to engage in that question and in that society-wide debate. So, yeah, I just wanted to end it there.
Danny, any last words before a question or two?
Maybe just in response to Josh, I will quote two amazing Black American writers, Mireille who said, "Hope is a discipline." And I think that's such a powerful way of looking at hope. It's not an idea, it's not a magic carpet that you can get on that will take you from the moment of anxiety to the moment of resolution. And then Marianus Annaeus Hegler, who said, "If you want hope, go out and earn it."
Thank you both. Do we have time for a question? Does anyone? Yep, at the front here.
Thanks very much to each of you. Really fascinating and brilliant discussion. It actually ended exactly where I hoped it was going to end. I've worked in the climate space in a number of different ways, and the thing that strikes me most profoundly is the level of anxiety, particularly as you move down the generations from old fogies like myself to younger and younger folk. And that paralysing anxiety is in part an inability to comprehend just how bad things are, or a paralysis by having actually comprehended just enough to be able to need to walk away from it. So the alternative there is that issue, that quality of hope. I just wonder if I could get you each to talk about exactly what hope means under those circumstances. There's false hope, and then there's the hope which actually grapples with the reality of the world that we've now created. How do you define hope under those circumstances in a way that addresses that anxiety but then overcomes it?
I think hope for me, I think it's helpful to distinguish between hope and optimism for me. I think the former is profoundly important and the latter can ring false, especially for the younger generations. Optimism is a feeling of certainty or near certainty that everything's going to turn out okay. And if you're looking at the scientific trajectories, if you're just living like Danielle is, embodied in the world around us, you know that not everything's okay and you don't have any guarantees around that. But hope for me, along with the discipline, is basically a feeling of indeterminacy, that we're not just on a conveyor belt towards a certain fate. That in fact, history is deeply contingent and we're living it every moment. And there's a large fan of outcomes that we have the ability to choose, that we're constantly in the ongoing process of choosing, and we don't know where it's going to land. We really don't. So for me, hope feels sort of like that indeterminacy, which feels like a kind of epistemological humility. But I also think hope is something that's co-created in community. And I wrote this book because I felt like the spaces I had to talk vulnerably about how I felt about the climate crisis were pretty anemic. So the best way I felt like I had at my disposal to create those spaces was to write a book and then talk to people about it. And that's been just an immensely meaningful experience for which I'm so grateful. And it's felt like the conversations that have been born from it, especially with the people I love, my parents, my partner, those conversations have felt like the material of hope.
Thanks for the question. Josh has answered it in many ways that I would. So given that we're at Jewish Book Week, I'm actually going to give a Jewish answer to that. It's an obligation to me. There's a midrashic teaching which says you must never give up hope. Because in a way, hopelessness is a profoundly selfish act. It's giving up on a willingness to stand in vulnerability and humility and not knowing, which we humans find very difficult to do. So I take hope as that obligation to do all that is possible and to remain faithful to possibility, even when that possibility is not a manifestation of my fantasy of the future.
And can I add one more, just to ground us in the material here?
I'm being given the wind-up signal, but these two wonderful writers will be at the bookshop to sign copies of their fabulous books. I encourage you to go and have a longer chat at the signing table. Thank you so much for coming so early on a Sunday morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.